PowerShell supports aliases and functions. Both of these are ways to create your own commands within the shell and have them execute whatever other commands you wish. Aliases are designed to handle single-line commands, where you type basically a shorter version of the command and it executes the full command. Functions are designed to perform more complex tasks from a single command issued on the command line. A function is essentially a named script that you can run without having to store separately. The functions in PowerShell can be simple functions like we have in Bash, where you run a command and it simply executes the script contained within the function block. However, in PowerShell, we can actually write our functions in such a way that PowerShell treats them as full commandlets. If the function is written to be run as a full commandlet, it automatically gets a number of parameters applied to it and some behaviors to do with handling output and errors, documentation, etc. Many aliases and functions are predefined in PowerShell. Most of the Unix-like commands or DOS-like commands are implemented using either aliases or functions, and they're there for a convenience. You can create your own aliases and functions very simply. One of the things to be aware of, as it happens when switching from shell to shell, is that variables can be handled differently from one shell to another. And indeed, variables in functions in PowerShell, unlike Bash, are handled differently. Existing variables in your script, when you call a function, get copied. When you access local variables inside a function in Bash, changes made to those variables in your function affect the rest of your script. So you can carry data back and forth from your functions in variables. In PowerShell, when you invoke a function, any variables that you use within the function are copies of the variables in the main script, and changes made in the function are lost when the function ends. Aliases and functions are both stored using a drive syntax type of naming. This is due to the use of providers, we'll talk more about later in the course. There are some commandlets available to you to look at what is available in aliases, and to create aliases, and to remove aliases. They're very straightforward. To see the list of aliases, you could use the commandlet get-alias. When you run this, you'll get a full list of all of the aliases. And since aliases are single line, they're pretty easy to see what they are. For example, when we run the command mv, we're actually invoking an alias, and it's running the commandlet move item. If we run the command man, it's actually running the command help, and so on. The aliases are stored on what we call the alias drive, and each alias is simply text that turns into another command when it runs. When we run the clear command to clear our screen, we're actually running clear host, and so on. Quite a few commands that you might be familiar with from Bash appear in this list. This is a good way to find out what commands in PowerShell, or commandlets, are very similar to Linux commands that you're familiar with. Not all of the Linux emulated commands are in this list. Some of them are in as functions. To create an alias, we're going to create a new item on our alias drive. A simple way to create those is to use the new-item commandlet, which allows us to create things that are on drives. Files on drives, directories on drives, aliases on drives, and so on. We use a drive naming type of path when we create these things. Using the -path parameter, we can tell it that we're making an alias by telling it to create something on the alias drive by calling it alias:. The name of the thing we create on the drive is the actual alias. So if I wanted to create the sort alias, the path would be alias:"sort. If I want to create an alias called np, the path will be alias:"np. So the name np on the alias drive. In order for an alias to be useful, it has to not only have a name, which is the alias we type, but it has to have something that the command turns into in order to run. That is a value. So this is the value to store in that path on the alias drive, and this should be the command you actually want to run. In my example, I'm creating an alias called np that when I type it, runs the command notepad. Note that new-item creates an object to represent the thing it made, in this case, an alias object. When we saw the output from makedir, it was because makedir actually runs new-item with some specific parameters telling it to make an item type directory. So if we are using something like new-item in a shell script, whether it's to create an alias or anything else, remember to deal with the output. You don't want this to come out and surprise a user. You would probably pipe this to out-null. Functions are very much like aliases, but they can be much more sophisticated in their implementation. An alias turns into a single-line command normally. A function is typically used when you want to create more than a single-line command or implement parameters for your command. Creating a function is done just like it is in Bash, or you can build it using commandlets. But the easiest way is to use the function command, specify a name for your new function. I'll use the example from the slide. And then have a script block that starts with a curly brace and ends with a curly brace. Inside that block are the commands to run when you type the myfunc function name as a command after you have defined the function. The function can consist of as many commands as you like. If I create this with a single command that creates a string object, doesn't tell PowerShell what to do with it, so the object falls off the end of the command line, PowerShell will catch it and display it. And I'll finish my function with the curly brace, which means if I run the command myfunc now, the commands that it runs will create and display a string and exit. It will finish the function. So myfunc just prints out, this is my function. This function exists just like the alias in memory, in process memory. Whether you create an alias or a function, once PowerShell exits, when the actual PowerShell window ends, that function or alias will disappear. It is not saved from one invocation of PowerShell to the next. Also, if you create another PowerShell window, even while this one is running, the new PowerShell window has its own memory, its own alias and function drive, and does not see the functions or aliases defined on this one. The alias and function drive are not hard drives, they are simulated drives. they have a lot of the same characteristics as a drive. For example, another way to see the alias list is to use the ls command or the dir command, whichever you prefer. They both actually turn into the commandlet getChildItem and tell it the drive you want to see. For example, the alias drive. This will produce the same list that the getAlias commandlet produced. To see the functions, we could list the function drive, and we'll see a list of all of the functions. Now, the function list looks a little different from the alias list. Aliases are very simple. One name turns into some other command. In the case of functions, the name of the function is the command to run. You'll notice the one I created, myfunc, is in here. But the definition of the function is not shown in this short list simply because it could potentially be hundreds of lines long. In order to see what is in a function, we need to use another similar concept to what we have with files. If we wanted to see what was in a file, we would use a command like cat to see what was in it. We can do the same thing with a function. If we use cat to say, show us what is in the function named myfunc by looking on the function drive for something called myfunc, we'll see the commands that are in there. To see the commands in any function, we can go ahead and take a look at those by saying, show me this object on the function drive. The more command is actually implemented with a function, and you'll notice this one has a little bit more to it. At the heart of it, it eventually uses the commandlet getContent, which is what cat actually turns into, on the file that you've given on the command line for more. So when we say more space file, the file name goes into $file. getContent retrieves the content of the file, and it pipes it through the more.com DOS command. So even though it's PowerShell, and even though it's very powerful and object-oriented and does all kinds of interesting things, you will find that under the covers they've taken a few shortcuts and not necessarily recreated things that they should. PowerShell is still being developed. PowerShell is still growing and changing. Presumably these things will change further as time goes on. To remove an alias or a function, you would use remove-item and give it the path to what you wanted removed. If I didn't want my function myfunc anymore, I would use remove-item function:myfunc, and it would remove that object from the function drive, and the function would be gone. The same thing can be used for aliases. Aliases and functions are very powerful. They allow you to create your own commands. We will revisit functions later when we talk about parameters, and we'll look at some of the extra things that are in these functions that let them be more powerful than just aliases, even if they're short, like the more function.